So now we are going to make the rest of the quilt. We have already stitched the quilting stitches on there. We have put the moon on with that beautiful blanket stitch. And in this video, I want to show you how to put all the trees on, how to stitch them down, what thread to use, how to do some intricate stitching inside of the trees. Then we'll face it and we'll put an embroidered signature on the back, a sleeve on the back, and you will have a completely finished quilt by the end. If you clicked on the link below and you printed out the pattern, you're going to get about 10 pages that look like this. Okay, and I need to explain just a little bit for you. You're going to get a guide that has each piece marked and lettered, alphabetically lettered, so that if you want to be that specific about how you do it. I tend to wing things, but some of you like to use a very specific pattern. So I have this here for you. So A is your sky, all one big huge piece here. And B is your snowy landscape down at the bottom. Okay. And then each of the trees, some of them are exact doubles, like J and K are the exact same tree. But all your trees are on here and you can choose which colors you want for them. I didn't specify which colors work. You can look at the original picture, JPEG picture of the quilt that I also put a link to. And that way you can see what colors I chose. Okay, then you're going to get the pattern that I made on EQ7. All right. And I numbered each page. So I'm doing this facing you. You're going to lay them out like this. Page 2. And there's a dotted line around each one. So you're going to lay them out like that. So the dotted lines are on top of each other, and then you'll see that the marks of the pattern will match up. So there are 4 across. And you're going to tape them together. I'm not going to bother doing this now because it's going to bore you to death. But I can just kind of see. There's my top row. And then your bottom row is going to go like this. Okay, you're going to tape everything together. And my page 7 has a smudge on it. I printed it out and I touched it too soon. So it's got a smudge. But you're still going to be able to figure it out, no problem. Now this tree, when you overlap, just be careful that you still can see both sides of the trunk. Okay, so that's how it's going to look. Then you know, it's all going to be taped together. You're going to take your freezer paper. I just go down to the grocery store and get my Reynolds freezer paper. I use a lot of this stuff. Okay. And you can cut off the whole entire sheet and trace all these lines. The first thing you're going to do is trace the outside edge and then trace the skyline, okay, the horizon line. Then you're also going to trace the bottom snowy landscape part. Those are your first 2 big pieces that you need to cut out. Then you can just take your leftover little bits of pieces to cut out all the trees. Okay, so let me just cut a piece of this paper, and I'm not going to trace the whole sky, but let me just trace one of the trees so you can see how I do it. Okay, it doesn't matter that all these are not taped together. So let me I'm going to trace the I tree. Oh, actually, it's too big. Let me trace the D tree, okay? So I have the paper so that it is shiny side up. The reason I want to do that is because when you iron it to your fabric, so like this is the right side of the fabric, this is the wrong side of the fabric, and you're ironing it to your fabric, you want the shiny side to stick to the back of the fabric. Okay, and this is not going to be a super hot iron, and you're not going to iron it super long. It's just enough to make the Reynolds freezer paper stick to the fabric. All right. So let me show you how I trace. Sometimes I just use a pencil. You can use a pen. Right here, I'm using a Sharpie marker, and you can see through the paper. Okay, and since this has really straight edges, I'm going to use my ruler. Okay. All right, so there we go. And there we go. And this bottom one is kind of curved because that's that horizon line that we want to tuck this tree behind. It's kind of curved. And you can always trim that down later, okay? And then you're going to cut this piece of paper out. Let me just do that quick. You're going to cut this piece of paper out right along that line. Okay, and then you take whatever tree fabric you want and place this on that fabric the way you want to, and then go to your ironing surface. Iron that down just for a few seconds, just enough to make it stick, and then you're going to rotary cut. Let me just show you. That's ironed down, okay? You're going to cut your fabric out right along that line. Now our trees are raw edge, okay? Horror of horrors, they are raw edge. If you want to turn under the edges of these trees, then you are going to have to cut 1/4 of an inch beyond the freezer paper mark, and then you can turn them under. If you want to do a real nice, some kind of fancy stitch on the edge or a satin stitch, I can show you later how to do a satin stitch, not in this video, but down the road, I will be showing you how to do that. Okay, so here's one of your trees. This is not an actual tree, this is my backing fabric. But anyway, so now you know how to do that pattern. Okay, have fun with it. So I am going to quilt the little flares going out in this moon. So just watch, and this is kind of my signature moon. I have a lot of moons in my quilts, moons and suns. So I make a little circle in the middle. There you go. Now I'm going to quilt around the edge of each tree. On this quilt, the trees are a little on the big side, but anyway, you can still see the technique. So I'm going to switch to some green super twist thread, and as soon as I do that, I'll be right back. It's all quilted there. I think you can see it. Looks great. Okay, so I've switched to the green super twist thread, and I'm just going to do a little outline around each tree. And I like to use a ruler when I'm doing this. So with these colors of Super Twist, I am only doing the real simple basic outline of the tree. And I'm going to switch back to the white shiny thread to do the inside design of each tree. So you'll see why in a little bit. I just need to roll my quilt. So that I have access to this tree right here. I just want to do that one yet, and then I'll be done outlining. And there you go. So our quilt is almost done. We just have the white thread, fancy little designs to do in the center of each tree yet. Okay, so I'm going to show you how I do a really nice little curly design in this little round lollipop tree. Here we go. So there you go. There's a nice curly little design. Now I don't make all the designs that fancy, but it was just, I don't know, it somehow fit the shape of that tree to make it really, really curly like that. I like to look on Pinterest and get ideas on Pinterest, and I was looking at just some mod. I think I punched in mod trees and got some really great line drawings of some trees that I thought were great. All right, and then this one is going to be a lot simpler. Here is my design I like to use for the fir tree. I'm going to go straight up and make my spine. So I'm making the boughs hanging down, and I do them in pairs. So if I do them in sets of 2, they just look a little better. And there you go. That's how I do the fir trees. And let's see, there's a couple other designs I can show you. I'm gonna have to roll my quilt again. Okay, let me do this one. This is another design that's really, really simple. And I still want to show you one more. It's just so fun to play around with making up designs as you go. But there was one more that I thought was really, really, really easy. Again, very, very simple. You're not going to have any problem doing this. Most of these, except for the curly one, are really easy to do on your domestic machine as well. That's it. How easy was that? All right, I'm going to finish these trees and then you can watch me put the square it up and put the facing on. Remember earlier I said I forgot to put the little dots on, the little white dots, making it look like the snow is falling. I know I have these big snowflakes on, but I just wanted a bunch of little white dots. And I have the same pearlescent paint from Pro Chemical and Dye. It's Profab Pearlescent Paint, and is it just in white. I'm also using my, I got this at Michael's. This is a Liquitex Basics round brush number 10. And so you just want to dab some little bits of paint. And of course, knowing me, there were those places I had some little splotches, and I'm going to use the paint on those spots so it looks like it's meant to be. Okay? Just little dabs of paint here and there. And it can be on the trees. It can be off the trees. Make them kind of big. Oops. Okay? It's just playful and fun. And gives the feeling of snow falling. And it was actually snowing today, so this is a perfect quilt for today. Do one on there. Okay, on my other quilt I had used a different brand of pearlescent paint, and it just came out silver for some reason. Maybe I didn't stir it enough. But I think this is looking great. So I'm thinking we are about done. This looks really good. Okay, so now I'm going to let that dry, and I'm going to clean up And we're going to let it dry. And by the way, you do need to heat set this paint. So let it dry really a nice long time. Usually it won't smear to the touch after like an hour, but it would be best if you waited 12 hours and then heat set it with an iron and make sure that none of it comes out. Okay, so after that's all heat set, we're going to cut the edges off, and I'm going to show you how to face a quilt. I face my quilts rather than binding them, and it's a nice clean edge, and I think you'll really enjoy that. So stay tuned. You'll learn how to face the quilt soon. For facing the quilt, you're going to take some of your backing, same color as your backing, and in this case it's kind of a white gray back, and it'll work just fine for the facing because most of the quilt is white gray. I'm going to cut 2.5 inch strips. Okay. So here's a nice long piece. That is the length of my quilt. Fold it in half, and I'm sure I can get two pieces out of this. So I line up the fold along one of my horizontal lines down here. Okay, so then you do 2.5 inches. So I've roughly cut out my quilt, but I need to perfectly square it up. So I see my top and bottom are pretty good. They're great. And then my sides need to be just a little bit more straight. So right here, cut this side nice and straight. And then this side as well. It looks like at the 1/2 inch mark. Is going to be just perfect. Okay. So now that it is completely squared up, what we're going to do, this is a facing. I'm not going to bind my quilt in the traditional manner, but it's going to be faced. So I don't want to tug and pull. Actually, I'm going to do the sides first. So I'm going to pin this. So the raw edge, this facing is 2.5 inches if you remember, and I folded it in half and pressed it. So then I just pull it kind of tight. You don't want any waves. You want your quilt to lay really flat, so it's kind of good to pull it, your facing, just slightly as you're pinning it on. Okay, and yet you want your quilt to stay the correct dimension. Okay, and then I'm going to cut the end of this off, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Raw edge and raw edge lined up right together. You could do this really fast. And then we're going to take this to the machine and stitch a 1/4 inch seam. All right. So I'm going to trim away that excess. And let's go to the machine and I'll show you how I stitch that on. We're going to use a 1/4 inch seam. And I have my walking foot on. And let me get my pins. Take the pins out as we go. And quick stitch that up. And my scissors. Seems like all my tools keep moving all around. There we go. Now there's a second step that we need to do that's really important when you're doing the facing. And that is to fold the facing over to the side. I don't usually press this, but I just pull it over to the side and do a neat little stitch along here that's going to catch this underneath seam allowance. You want it to be narrow enough that it's going to catch that. So it's less than 1/4 inch. It's actually, I don't think it's 1/8 of an inch. I don't know. But what you're doing is catching this seam so that when you fold it over, it's going to be very neat and none of the facing is going to show on the front when you have your quilt hanging on the wall. So let me just finish that quick. Okay. Oops. All right. So you're going to do that on both sides, and then I'll show you how we do the top and bottom. So we have the sides stitched on, and we have that little tiny row of stitches down the sides, and then we're going to do the top and bottom. So when I start pinning the top and bottom, I want this to be maybe 3/8 of an inch over the seam line when I start. Yeah. And we're going to trim the corners and everything, but I'll show you later how to do that. So again, you're going to pull it a little bit tight, not really yanking at all. The top doesn't matter so much because it's going to be hanging on a curtain rod or a bamboo hanger or something. Okay, that's perfect. And then the bottom, same thing, 3/8 of an inch. And the raw edges are together. Pull it slightly when you pin it. Okay, and the bottom is probably the most important section to make sure that it's tight. The bottom of your quilt tends to be the part that gets the most wavy when it's hanging there, and I'm really a stickler for making my quilts hang flat. All right, so right here, trim it 3/8 of an inch. There you go. And then we're going to sew that on, but it's really important. I want to show you how I start these pieces of facing. The top and bottom are a little different than the way you do the sides. So let's go to the machine and do that. The way that you start the facing here, I just want to adjust this a little bit. I didn't press it quite exactly. You're going to stitch down right on the seam line, right exactly on that seam line. So you want your stitches to run right inside of this seam right here. Okay, and then you're going to pivot and come down 1/4 of an inch. So let's do that. And let's stitch off this piece as we got to start into the quilt a ways. All right, here we go. And back tack to secure your stitches. All right, that looks like 1/4 of an inch. And then we're going to pivot and keep sewing down. All right, then when you get to the end, you're going to make sure that you stop right on that seam line, right inside of that seam line. And sometimes it looks like it's right, and then when you turn it, you realize you're a little off. But actually, this turned out great. So you stitch up, back tack when you get near the end. And here we're going to lift up our needle and trim that close. And now, good. Now we have to do that extra little stitch here, but we can't get all the way to the end. So you're just going to get as close as you can. So let me show you how I do that. Okay. I kind of just fold this down and I'm going to start right there. It's probably 1.5 inches away from the end. So that's where I'm going to begin. And hold your threads so they don't bunch up. Back tack. Hold that facing, make sure it's tight away because we didn't press it. We're just going to kind of smooth it out. And same thing on the end. You're going to stitch close to where you have that folded down, back tack, and then trim that off. And then you'll do the same thing on the other side. And then I will show you how I turn it. Okay, one thing I want to show you how to do is trimming up your corners. So I'm going to come across here. See if I can draw that. I'm going to come across here. I'm going to cut close to the corner and then go off this way. Okay, so let me try that with the scissors. You got to be really careful that you don't cut into where the stitches are. But if you don't want the corners to be bunchy and bulky, you've got to trim this. Okay, so there you go. I've trimmed. Clean that up a little. There you go. Okay, and then we're going to turn it. You can push with your finger in there, but that's not quite going to be enough to make it a really sharp 90-degree corner. So take your, I'm taking this scissors that has a nice point on it and just push that in there. You might need to turn the scissors a little bit, play around with it a little bit. There you go. And then you're going to pin all the way around. You're going to pin that. Pin this corner in, and you're going to need to sew this by hand. Okay, so that's how your corner is going to look. You're going to press it really carefully to make sure that none of that facing is showing, but you're going to pin it all the way around, sew it by hand. There you go. If you have an embroidery machine, you can take a piece of your backing and I fold a piece of tearaway. It's got to be at least double. You can even triple it. But take your hoop and put this in your hoop. And I have my machine programmed. If you have an embroidery machine, you can program it to write your name. All right, so I have my machine programmed to do a nice little border. I will show you. Yeah, I've got my machine set to do a nice little frame with a scalloped edge, and let me get that started. Okay, so the scallop frame is done, and then in my memory I have my first name, Rachel B. So first name and the first letter of my maiden name, Blosser. Okay, so I'm working on layout to get it a little smaller. And then I'm going to raise it up a little farther. Okay, and start that. Perfect. Okay, so it'll stitch my first name and the B, my middle initial. Okay, so now the first name and middle initial are done, and then I go back to retrieve my last name. Retrieve, and then downsize that. Oh, I'm gonna sneeze. Layout. Okay, and then lower it so it fits. I'm gonna snip some of these threads here. They get in the way. They're annoying. You don't want to snip that thread, but okay, that should work great. Okay, so now it will stitch Durstine, and then our embroidered signature will be done. Okay, so I pop it out of the hoop, and all these little extra threads that you don't need, you're just going to snip them off. Some of them are easier than others. Snip, snip, just get rid of them. Okay, and then you have all this excess tear away, so just tear it off. This stuff on the inside doesn't really matter. You can leave that there. Now this border is just way too big, so take your scissors and just cut it down. You know, cut it down like that. I'd say, I don't know, 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch, maybe 3/4 of an inch away from the scalloped edge, if you're doing a scallop. Okay, so that's ready to go, and you're just going to turn the edges under, and you'll applique that onto the back of your quilt. Here's the quilt that is all done. I finished facing it by hand, and I finished the embroidered signature that you saw me do earlier. I stitched that on by hand. I turned the sides under and did all that. So now the last thing we have to do is add the hanging sleeve up here on the top. So I'm going to cut a piece of fabric exactly the width of the quilt. Exactly the width of the quilt. Okay, and then you want this sleeve to actually be shorter than the quilt. Okay, that's good. And I'm going to make it about 5 inches. 5 inches wide. And then I need to bring this over a little bit longer. Now, on a larger quilt that you would be sending out to a competition or something, or a quilt show, you would need to make it definitely, whoops, that didn't work out. You would need to make the sleeve definitely bigger, because when it's hanging on one of those huge poles that they hang the quilts on, it's going to curl around if it's only 5 inches. You see, sometimes you see the tops of those quilts that are curled. That's because the hanging sleeve is not big enough. It needs to have a lot of ease. But a little quilt this size, you're going to be hanging on either a bamboo hanger or a curtain rod or a wooden slat, and it's just not going to take that much space. So, okay, so the way we're going to do this, we're going to turn the ends of these, just turn it over about 3/8 of an inch, and then maybe another 3/8 of an inch or 1/2 an inch, and then I'm going to finger press that down. Okay, and I'm going to go take that to the machine and sew it. I'm going to do the same thing to the other side, And then I want to come back and show you how I'm going to pin this on and how I'm going to sew it on. We're going to stitch down the end of this sleeve, and let's just do that real quick. And get one more tab for the other end. There we go. Okay, and I'm going to do that same thing on the other side. We now have our hanging sleeve hemmed on both sides, and it is about 1/2 inch shorter on both ends, so that you can hang the quilt without anything showing if you want. So now what we're going to do is turn the top of the hanging sleeve under about 1/2 inch, and you're going to line it up with the top of the quilt, but not all the way to the top. You want it down about 1/2 inch lower than the top of the quilt. So you're going to start in the middle after you've checked the sides to make sure they're the right distance from the end, and you're going to work from the middle, pinning this sleeve down. Just keep pinning, keep turning under, and try to keep your distance from the top very even so it's not waving. So there you go. You got one end done. And now we have to pin the other way, going to the other end. When you have that pinned, you are going to stitch all this by hand. You have to do it by hand because you don't want it to show through to the front. So now, really quickly, I'm going to move these pins as though I have stitched it down by hand, because I want to show you how I manipulate this sleeve so that it has a little give. You're going to move it up so that it lines up exactly with the top of the quilt. So move that fold up to the top so it's not peeking out. There you go. You can see that it's not showing. That's really important because it's a white sleeve and the top of your quilt is a black sky. Then when that's lined up at the top, you're going to fold under the bottom of the sleeve also 1/2 inch and pin that down. So you will keep pinning this so it is, the top is flush with the top of the quilt, and turn under the bottom, pin it, and then you will also stitch that by hand. If you pretend this little pen is a curtain rod or a slat, you can see that the sleeve has a little give, and that's really, really important so that it hangs right and it doesn't have a curl at the top of the quilt. Okay, so I'm going to go stitch that by hand. It's important that you don't have anything showing on the front. All your stitches have to be blind. In other words, stitch just through the back of the quilt and the batting if you want. I want to show you close up what's going on here. You can see the little dabs of paint. You can see the quilting. Sorry, I got my cord in the way. And I especially wanted to show you the moon. It's all quilted there. I think you can see it. Looks great. Okay. And then there's that little curly tree, and it's looking good. So that is the finished quilt. I've done the facing on it. You can see the facing there. I've done the embroidered signature. Looks great. And then up here, I have the hanging sleeve. Okay, so there is your finished quilt. I hope you have fun making yours, and let me know if you have any problems or any questions. I would love to hear from you. So there you have it. We have completely finished this beautiful landscape quilt. I hope you enjoyed this video, and check all the links below. There are links to thermofax screens. There are links to thread. There is a link to the pattern that you can download and print out. There are links to my quilting and sewing classes. So if you would like to sign up and be on the waiting list for my quilting and sewing classes, please sign up below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please sign up for my channel and put a like on this video. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you soon.